were the first words that slipped from Evelyn's cracked lips when Samuel McGraw found her. The voice was so hollow, so broken. It made even a hardened rancher like Samuel stop in his tracks. He had seen his share of storms, droughts, and gunfights in Dodge City, but never had he witnessed a sight this haunting. There she was, a young woman no older than 25, slumped on the wreck of an old wooden wagon. Her hair was matted, her face pale as chalk, her skin was covered with bruises. In some places it was torn, dried blood clinging like rust on iron. The only thing hiding her body was a filthy scrap of cloth, barely enough to cover her, not nearly enough to protect her from the night air that had swept across the prairie. For a moment Samuel thought she might already be gone. Her eyes were open but empty, staring through him as if she had nothing left to give this world. Only that whispered confession proved she was still alive, though her soul seemed ready to surrender. He stood there, frozen, feeling a tightness in his chest that words could never describe. Then he did the one thing a decent man could do. Samuel slowly peeled off his own shirt, and the only one he had on his back, still warm from his body and smelling faintly of sweat and wood smoke. Without a word, he draped it over her trembling shoulders. She flinched at first, like a wounded bird expecting another blow, but then she let her arms drop, too weak to resist, too broken to care. That wagon she had spent the night in was no shelter. It was a forgotten husk, abandoned on the edge of the Santa Fe Trail. The boards were split, the wheels long shattered. The wind had howled through every crack, cold enough to chill a man to the bone, and yet this young woman had been left to endure it half naked and alone. Step by step, Samuel guided her away from that wreck toward the safety of his ranch. He didn't ask her name, didn't press her with questions. Her eyes already told him more than words ever could. They were the eyes of someone who had lost all faith, who had been beaten down until there was nothing left inside. And as he walked beside her, one thought weighed heavy in his mind, a thought that any man or woman watching this story would ask themselves too. What kind of husband could be so cruel to cast his own wife out into the night, to leave her shivering and bleeding in a broken wagon like an unwanted animal? Samuel led Evelyn into the small guest room of his ranch house. The air inside smelled of coffee grounds and old pine, a sharp contrast to the dust and sweat outside. He set her down gently on the edge of the bed and pulled a quilt over her shoulders. For a long moment, she just stared at the floor, silent, as if she wasn't sure whether she was safe or still trapped in some nightmare. When Samuel handed her a bowl of warm broth, her hand shook so badly he had to steady it for her. She sipped, then coughed, then sipped again. Only after a few minutes did she whisper her name, Evelyn. Her voice was raw, like it hadn't been used in days. She said she didn't belong there, that she should never have come, that trouble would follow her wherever she went. Samuel leaned back in his chair and said nothing. He had learned long ago that sometimes silence was kinder than questions. And then the story came out, bit by bit, between ragged breaths. Her husband, Thomas Carter, a blacksmith from Abilene, a man with fists as heavy as iron and a temper sharpened by whiskey. He had always been jealous, always watching, always ready to believe the worst. If another man so much as tipped his hat to Evelyn, Thomas would come home swinging, his knuckles finding her ribs, his belt finding her back. Last night had been worse than usual. She had spoken a few kind words to a neighbor. Nothing more. Thomas saw it, and that was enough. He dragged her across the floor, tore the clothes from her body, and threw her out like trash. When she begged to come back inside, he locked the door and told her to freeze. All she had for shelter was that broken wagon by the trail. That was where Samuel had found her at dawn. Samuel listened without a word. His jaw tightened, his weathered hands clenched on the arm of the chair. He had seen cruelty in his time, but hearing this stirred something deeper, something dangerous. Evelyn caught the look in his eyes, and for the first time in years, she felt a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, not all men were like Thomas. But then she lowered her head and whispered a warning. Trouble was coming. Thomas would never let her go. And when he found out where she was, he would bring hell with him. So the question now was simple. When Thomas came looking for her, what would Samuel do? The morning sun had barely cleared the prairie when the sound of hooves thundered across the yard. Evelyn froze where she sat, spoon halfway to her lips. She didn't need to look out the window. She knew. Thomas Carter came storming onto Samuel's ranch like a man on fire. His face was twisted with rage, his shirt half unbuttoned, the stink of whiskey drifting even in the summer air. He swung down from his horse, boots hitting the dirt hard, and began shouting her name. Samuel wasn't there. He had ridden out early to check the cattle. That left Evelyn alone. Trembling in the doorway of the house, she thought about hiding, but there was no time. Thomas had already spotted her. He grabbed her by the arm before she could step back. His grip was iron, the kind of grip that had broken her before. He yanked her into the yard and began his tirade, accusing her of betrayal, of shame, of lying with another man. His voice carried across the ranch, loud enough for the cattle to stir and the birds to scatter. Then came the fist, one to her shoulder, another to her side. Evelyn tried to fight back, but her strength was gone. She crumpled to the dirt as he kept screaming that she belonged to him, that no rancher, old or young, would ever take her away. Just then the rhythm of hooves sounded again, slower but heavier this time. Samuel had returned. He pulled his horse to a stop at the gate, eyes narrowing at the sight before him. Evelyn bleeding in the dirt, Thomas standing over her with fists clenched. Samuel's jaw tightened. He stepped down, his boots steady, his hands curling into fists of their own. He walked straight into the yard, placed himself between Evelyn and Thomas, and said in a voice that left no room for doubt, "That's enough. Not here. Not ever again." Thomas spat at the ground, tried to shove past him, but Samuel stood like a wall. One shove from Samuel sent the blacksmith stumbling back into the dust. The look in the old rancher's eyes was enough to freeze him. It was the look of a man who had seen too much, who would no longer stand by while another suffered. Evelyn struggled to her feet behind him, clutching Samuel's shirt sleeve for balance. For the first time, she wasn't facing Thomas alone. And right here is where the story's just getting started. If you want to see how a rancher, with nothing but his honor, stands up against a blacksmith fueled by rage, stick around and subscribe if you want to hear the rest of these Old West tales. 'Cause next, Samuel will ride out to find an old friend, a man with enough power to change everything. Samuel knew Thomas would not give up. A man like that never walked away quietly. He would be back, drunker and meaner. And next time he would not just come with fists. Samuel had seen enough of that type to know trouble was only just beginning. So he saddled his horse the next morning and set out on the trail to Dodge City. The ride was long, the sun hot on his back, but Samuel's mind was clear. There was only one man who could put fear into Thomas Carter, and that man was an old friend of his, Don Ricardo Alvarez. Some called him a businessman. Others whispered he was closer to an outlaw with a fine suit. Either way, Ricardo held sway over half the cattle trade and more than a few of the rougher men in Kansas. If Ricardo said a man should be left alone, folks tended to listen. When Samuel rode up to Ricardo's place, he was greeted with cautious stares. Ricardo was not the kind of man you visited lightly. But when the two old men finally met face to face, Ricardo broke into a slow grin. He poured whiskey, slapped Samuel on the shoulder, and listened as Samuel laid out the story of Evelyn and the beating she had endured. Ricardo's smile faded quick. He leaned back in his chair, eyes dark. "A man who does that to a woman has no honor," he said, "and in my world, a man without honor has no place." That same evening, Thomas was brought into the saloon by a pair of Ricardo's men. He strutted at first, trying to act tough, but when Ricardo's voice cut through the smoke-filled room, the swagger melted away. Ricardo told him plain and simple, if Thomas ever laid a hand on Evelyn again, he would not just lose his wife, he would lose everything. His trade, his standing, maybe even his life. The saloon went quiet, every eye in the room fixed on Thomas. He swallowed hard, his face pale, and for the first time in his life, he backed down. He muttered something under his breath and stormed out into the night. Evelyn was safe, at least for now, but safety is not the same as peace, and healing is a longer road than fear. And that brings us to the final part of this story, where a broken woman and a weary rancher discover that love sometimes blooms in the quietest places. For the first time in what felt like forever, Evelyn could breathe. The nights were still quiet out on Samuel's ranch, but the silence no longer felt like punishment. It felt like rest. She began to rise early, helping Samuel with the cattle, learning how to mend fences and ride the pastures. Each small task stitched a piece of her spirit back together. Samuel never asked much of her. He offered no grand speeches. no promises he could not keep. What he did offer was steady presence. He showed her how to saddle a horse, how to check the herd at dusk, how to plant hay for the winter. He did it with patience, and in his patience Evelyn found a kind of safety she had never known. The bruises on her skin began to fade, but it was the scars inside that took longer. Some nights she still woke shaking, afraid that Thomas would kick down the door. On those nights, Samuel would sit quietly nearby, saying nothing, letting her know she was not alone. And in the quiet, something unexpected began to grow. It was not the rush of young romance. It was something slower, something deeper. By the time the summer sun dipped low over the Kansas plains, Evelyn and Samuel shared more than chores. They shared trust. They shared quiet meals on the porch, laughter at the stubborn mule that refused to pull its weight, and long silences that somehow said more than words ever could. It was in those silences that Evelyn realized her heart was healing. This story is not just about cruelty and rage. It is about the choice to protect instead of harm. It is about the kind of strength that comes not from fists, but from patience and honor. And maybe it is about the truth that love does not always shout. Sometimes it whispers, sometimes it simply waits, and sometimes it arrives when two broken souls meet at the right time. So let me ask you, what would you have done in Samuel's place? Would you have had the courage to stand up to a man like Thomas? And if you were Evelyn, would you have found the strength to trust again? If this story touched you, I invite you to give it a like so more folks can hear it. And if you want more tales from the Old West, full of grit, pain, and the rare kind of love that changes everything, then be sure to subscribe so you never miss the next chapter. Because in the wide open plains of America's past, there are countless more stories waiting to be told.